This is the Conversations with the Mind podcast, where we explore consciousness through conversations with interesting people. Our mission is to engage the collective mind piece by piece to bring greater clarity of mind to our listeners locally and across the planet, and to contribute to broaden the shared experiential knowledge and wisdom of existence. What's up, YouTube? Welcome back to Conversations with the Mind. Here we go. Hey, folks. Welcome back to Conversations with the Mind. I'm your host, Shane Lemaster. This is episode 45, and we're sitting here with special guest Patrick Gorman. How are you, sir?
Doing good. How are you?
I'm awesome. Thank you for coming on the show.
Oh, yeah, no problem.
Yeah. So I always start my podcast off with the same question. And you've heard the podcast before, so you know it's coming.
Yeah.
Which I appreciate. So anyway... The podcast is called Conversations with the Mind, and the audience knows what that means to me and have heard a number of guests as far as what they think that means. So I want to hear from you, what is Conversations with the Mind? What does that phrase itself mean to you, and how does it resonate?
Yeah, well, since hearing it before, I thought about it a lot, and so pretty much Conversations with the Mind reminds me of looking within, like, meditation or trying to do a self-analyzation. I feel like my mind is a whole made up of many parts, so that there's different aspects of me that I can feel within me, but they all lead to a one unified voice. Mm-hmm. So the conversation is the communication I have with the different parts of myself.
Nice. With that. Do you have a meditation practice of your
own? So I remember asking you at the gym, talking about, I've never studied meditation, but I've had So in cool down for Judo, mm-hmm. one of it is to mukso. Mm-hmm. It's you have to sit there, and what I was taught is clearing your mind of everything and just letting it relax. Mm-hmm. So that was the first one I ever learned, and that was maybe 8 or 9 when I first started Judo. The other ones are just visualization. I've just heard people talk about it before, visualizing winning or, visualizing what you want kind of thing. What I use it for is, I envision what's going on inside my body, what sensations mean, and trying to further define them to understand what exactly the pain or whatever is telling me. So, for injuries and stuff like that.
Almost like a diagnostic tool.
Yeah.
Nice. So you're using... What in the industry we call a body scan meditation, right? Where you're scanning from head to toe in no particular order. I mean, sometimes there's an order, but scanning from head to toe and really tuning in with mindfulness and paying attention to present moment awareness and sensation in different parts of your body, almost one at a time, so that you can do that diagnostic and be okay, I feel pain here, but when I move it, does it change? And what is the quality of the pain? Is it stinging? Is it dull? Is it, and doing that body scan. I love that you're doing that. That's awesome. Yeah. And then the first one you described is more like Zen meditation, right? Which is Japanese based. Obviously, Zen is from Japan, and Judo's from Japan too. So yeah. pretty obvious connection there. But yeah, in no mind or Zen meditation, that is just a clearing of the objective is to clear the mind of all thought and all projection, all visualization, everything. Mm-hmm. And very calming, very relaxing to do that practice. There's many forms of meditation, and I try and do as many different types as I can they're all different tools, right?
Yeah.
Some are diagnostic, some are, more intentional, and you can do actual healing work through meditation. Some are, like you said, visualizing. So I do a lot of work like that for myself and with the athletes I work with through sports psychology to help them visualize the win and visualize overcoming obstacles that they foresee, right, in a match or, whatever sport. And also visualizing for just general manifestation in life, not just in sport too, but the law of attraction and things like that, right? Manifesting things first in your mind with a vision or a goal or something, and then going out and doing it, but also, which I hope we get to talk to, we can talk to this topic a little bit more today, is the physical nature of thought, right? And how thought actually has a physical nature.
Yeah.
You know, when we think of consciousness or thinking, we think that it's like completely empty, that it's it's ethereal, it's kind of free floating out there. But really, when we've studied it, it has very defined frequency and vibration, and we know that frequency and vibration is what everything is made out of energetically, and so it makes sense that our thoughts can have an influence, either positive or negative, on physical matter around us and on other people too.
One of my favorite examples of that is it's Star Trek and the e-reader.
I'm not familiar with Star Trek too much.
Oh, okay. Well, in Star Trek, it came out in the 80s. But on there, I know Next Generation for sure, but they have e-readers on it. It's just like a digital book, basically, that, it changes and it's a screen and everything. Way when that was science fiction. But now we have those. And so people have made the argument that maybe that the reason the iPad and all of that, the tablet exists, is because people saw it in Star Trek and they're like, oh, I want that, I want to create that. And so that the imagination fed into reality that way.
And it almost has like an intergenerational effect too. Like someone else's imagination in the last generation suddenly spurs Steve Jobs in this generation to go out and actually create it.
Yeah,
that's pretty cool. That's a direct link to like cosmic or unified consciousness. I think that's something I've talked about in previous podcasts, is like, how do we access that collective consciousness, that database of information that we all are tapped into individually, but how do we tap into the collective to get bigger downloads, right, of more information? And I think that's a great example of exactly how we can do that, is paying attention to and admiring and watching other people's imagination unfold in like these sci-fi type settings, or in fictional works, either written or on video, and then it's spurring us into action to actually create that, right? So whatever we're imagining today for technology or for whatever, our kids are going to be the ones who actually create that based off of our imagination.
Yeah.
It's pretty interesting. And then you said conversations with the mind, for you, is talking to these different parts of yourself. Can you talk a little bit more about the different parts of yourself?
Yeah, so I kind of identify the different thoughts and emotions I feel to like the different parts of me. So like one that's a very stark one is like the fight or flight response. It's like this like chilling feeling I feel come up, and it kind of like I can feel it locks out like my rational mind, and it's like a feeling, and it's like a reaction all of its own that takes over me. And
but you can feel it before the decision needs to be made to fight or flee.
Yeah, it's like a different part of me has tripped the default, and like it's taken over me. So it's like it's not my conscious mind is in control of my body anymore. My movements are involuntary, and I think that's part of like the definition of fight or flight, is it's just like it's faster than your brain can react, and it's like a defense mechanism, basically.
It's like a reflex.
Yeah. So that's one I can definitely, the few times like when you're like a startle or a scare, when you get that, I can feel that part overtake. The other thing, it's like just listening to like the cost benefit analysis you do in your head about any sort of decision. There's always, you debate yourself. There's different voices. Like there's the more aggressive voice in me, that wants to, just take a more aggressive position, or, more aggressive action. And then there's, the calmer part of me that's like, calm down, it's not worth it. That, like an example of when you want to get angry, but then, you don't want the consequences that come along with doing that.
Absolutely.
And so it's like that inner debate right there is just different parts of me.
Yeah. And, it can be classified in so many different ways, but what came to mind when you're talking about that is like almost, emotional mind versus rational mind, but also those two umbrellas have a lot of different components underneath them and characterizations as well. I think, the emotional mind, we can present these different parts of ourselves from many different emotions, right? Excitement, anger, fear, stress, sadness, all these things are different parts of ourself that we can directly converse with if we take the time to like slow our thoughts down and actually have that debate in our head.
Yeah.
But then also underneath, you know, the rational mind side, there's like our analytical side. There's you know, there's all sorts of different aspects of self that we can converse with and get information from. So it's not just black or white, one or the other, but it's many different, you know, almost fractalized identities within us.
Yeah.
But you said working towards this one, how did you put it? Like this one unified consciousness within yourself.
The way I think of it, it's like a board of people all talking, and then that what I am is a consensus between all those people.
Mm-hmm.
And so with that, I have an interesting, kind of makes me think, have an interesting idea, and I have no idea if this is true or not, but like, you know, schizophrenia is that you can't come to a, you know, consensus, and that they have this voice that they hear within them that they don't recognize as themselves. I've asked Cody about this, and I've talked a little bit, but never got anything definitive, but I always thought that would be interesting.
Mm-hmm.
If, you know, like an implication. But that's what it feels like to me in my head, is that there's all these different parts of me that are talking, that, but I recognize them as myself. And then I, you know, it gets codified into words, and then I speak.
So maybe this overarching, for you, a non-schizophrenic, or someone who's not, who's not affected by schizophrenia directly, it's almost like the board meeting is happening, but you're able to maintain the walls of the meeting room.
Yeah.
Right, so nothing gets out of control. You're like a regulator, right?
Yeah.
A referee. Whereas someone who is affected with schizophrenia might have the same boardroom, but they might not be able to maintain the structure of the walls or maintain the safety of the participants in there, right? There might be one voice that is maybe louder than the others, or more aggressive and takes liberties at the expense of other voices, right? Or something like this. That's interesting, because I studied shamanism a little bit in college, and the way that a lot of different tribes across the world view specifically people who are affected with symptoms similar to what we would classify as schizophrenia. I mean, obviously they don't have classification of schizophrenia in their tribal cultures, but these are the people that become shamans. You know, these are the people that what we classify as mentally ill by our standards, are the ones who are venerated, the people who are held up on high in these tribal cultures, because they have access to these other voices, right? And maybe it could be that they are receiving, like they have another open channel where they are receiving messages from a voice outside of their own consciousness. That's always a possibility too.
Right.
And the tribes believe that, you know, these are the people that are gonna speak up first about natural disaster long before it happens, about plagues that are coming before they ever happen, and the tribe really heeds these warnings and listens to them. And it's something we don't do in our culture. You know, we kind of demonize those things.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. So, what was your path? I mean, you and I have talked a little bit about your interests in some of these areas, and we're going to dig into a wide range of different topics. But like, what was sort of your pathway to even becoming interested in these bigger topics, or you know, ideas like consciousness, metaphysics, geometry, mathematics, things like that? What got you interested?
Well, I'd have to say the first thing is having really good teachers in high school. So I've had a biology teacher who ended up being a medicinal chemistry teacher for me, Mr. Choi. He was very influential in my life. He really, like, you know, really helped, like, didn't let people get, I wouldn't say left behind, but, you know, he was very interested in your mental progression. So he had a lot of encouragement. In fact, that medicinal chemistry class was completely created because 4 students got together and we just wanted to learn about that. And so he found a way to get the class made.
Nice.
Yeah. So, I mean, like in high school, I was doing psychedelics, like LSD and mushrooms.
Was this a private school you were at?
Yeah.
Okay.
The Latin School of Chicago.
Okay. So you're doing them while you're in school, or like on breaks? things like that?
On breaks, but I didn't really regulate it at that time. So I mean, I don't really remember. It could have been during school as well.
So this is a time of, like, number one, mental and emotional development, right? We're in our teens here. So it's a crazy time with hormones and new thoughts, and now we start to question life and death and all these things, and sex and rebirth and all these things. Not only that, but you're throwing on recreational psychedelic use, which I know from my experience in my teens, that blew my mind wide open to the possibility of exploring it in the first place. And then also, you're getting like this amazing support from one of your teachers, one of your mentors that you really look up to, who's really invested in your mental development. That kind of, I don't know, for me, if I was in that position, I would start to take a notice of my own interests in my mental development too.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I'd have to say it all started, like, right there, pretty much. And then I went to Marietta College for a semester for biochemistry. And there I was taking, like, 20 credit hours, so it was quite a bit of work. But why I wanted to take, I was doing a double major of biology and chemistry. I was taking a lot of classes because I wanted the overlap to make the connections between how chemistry and biology, how they work together. Mm-hmm. Instead of just you just, like, look at the parts of it.
Mm-hmm. You wanted to see the machine, in its entirety.
Exactly.
Nice.
And so from there I learned a whole bunch of interesting things about pharmacology and, like, further about what, like, physically is happening in your brain when you're taking, hallucinogens. Or, like, one of the big questions I had at first was, is this, like, a new experience? Like, is this something that's, am I experiencing something that no human has ever experienced before, or am I experiencing something that's, like, already within me and it's just bringing it out of me? And that's kind of like, so, like, the science definition of it is that it's just neurotransmitters, exciting receptor sites that's opening up channels, the calcium channels and the potassium channels or whatever, and that's causing, an action potential. And but that the receptors themselves are already in you. Mm-hmm. So that idea seems to say that, what LSD or what any drug makes you feel, it's already within you. It's just bringing that out of you.
Yeah, it's almost like a catalyst.
Yeah.
That it's not necessarily, and that's how a lot of our drugs work. That's how a lot of pharmaceuticals work. Is that they have an action within your own systems to get your own systems to produce, more dopamine or more serotonin or block those things, right? Other things like that. So that makes a lot of sense. And I told this story, I think, a couple podcasts ago, where they gave this monk he'd been a long time meditator, like 50, 60 years of meditation. They gave him a bunch of LSD once, and then asked him after the trip, what was your experience like? They were really eager to hear, like, what someone who had been exploring the mind for all these years thought of an LSD trip. And he said, I didn't notice anything different than what my normal everyday experience is like.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And so, and he has no reason to lie. He's a monk. But I do believe that psychedelics can catalyze that experience, right? But I also believe that experience is inborn within us, and we can generate our own psychedelic experiences without the use of drugs, right? We know that because of, breath work. Breath work can do that. Stan Grof's holotropic breath work is most well known for that. So inducing psychedelic states just through hyperventilation, through all sorts of different techniques that way, through yoga, meditation. People have gotten in psychedelic states, even, and psychedelic just means mind manifesting. That's how it's defined. So there's a lot of different ways to do this without drugs. It gets kind of mixed up with the terminology of, like, altered state of consciousness, right? Which is also important to talk about too, but people experience that from the time they're young. I remember spinning around on the playground over and over, trying to get myself as dizzy as possible to fall over, and having a blast.
Yeah.
It's in our nature to want to experiment with our consciousness and alter it in different ways and just run these self-experiments to kind of figure out what this whole thing's about.
Well, a big thing to me is that we talked about this before, how everything is relative and how perspective can change everything, you know, when even in like, you know, physics, like, you know, changing your perspective changes the way the dynamics of like the earth, or is the, like the thing we were talking about is the moon spinning, and from the perspective of earth it's not, but from the perspective of the sun it is.
Right, because it's locked in to Earth's orbit, so we only get to see one side of the moon at any time.
Yeah.
But yeah, like you said, if you take a wider view around the sun, then it is spinning the same way that the Earth is spinning.
Yeah, and then so when you take like psychedelics, or if you change your perspective, like alter your consciousness, or, you know, is to me is changing your perspective, and you can inherently have access to more information because you're able to form more concepts, you know, collect different types of information that weren't available to you before.
Yeah, well, I mean, think of any memory that you have, right? It's usually from one perspective.
Yeah.
Usually from your perspective, but as, I mean, we talked about this too with the holographic universe as a theory, you know, that there's infinite amount of perspectives to be taken. I mean, in this situation right now, I'm sitting across from you on the table, right? But I'm seeing you from my perspective. If I could just for a moment take this perspective of this plant that's sitting right here next to us, you know, and what it senses between both of us, that's one out of an infinite amount of perspectives that can be taken about the same situation. And we do this in therapy, we do this in psychedelic assisted therapy as well, bringing up trauma from the past that people have, and then allowing them to experience it from a different perspective than what the trauma is sitting in, right? So whatever experience you had, say it was like a bad car wreck, you get in a bad car wreck when you're young, and you just have this PTSD around long car rides, or car rides up in the mountains, or on icy roads or something. Well, that's from your perspective as being, you know, the person in the car when the crash happened. But if for a moment in therapy or in psychedelic assisted therapy, you can bring that trauma back to the surface to where the feeling is real for the person, and then have them just for a few minutes take the perspective of something else outside of themselves, then they're oftentimes able to see, you know, like kind of drop the personal story that they've attached to it, and now see it from an objective point of view, that maybe, you know, the car wreck was a terrible tragedy, but it also catalyzed this change in their life and helped lead them down this direction, and it was a good thing in a lot of ways too. So they're able to see different perspectives on the same event and then heal themselves and move forward. I think that that's as far as I know, only a human characteristic, to be able to run simulations in our mind to take these other perspectives, but so important.
Right.
Yeah, so what was your, you know, going through high school, you're figuring these things out, and how did the perspective stuff fit into that?
Oh, like how did changing my perspective and everything?
Sure.
One of the more enlightening parts was, I feel like empathy was a big development just from being able to change perspectives. Like, I got a physical feeling of like someone else's life and how it would be my own.
Right.
And it was like an uncomfortable like forcing into that perspective, but then once you see that, you know, there's all these different emotions, and everything you feel also applies to other people, it makes me more considerate of their feelings, and makes me more acknowledge a world beyond myself, I guess.
I think that's a skill that not everyone has.
I would agree. I feel like there's people wouldn't do some of the things they do if they recognize that.
Yeah, I know. For me, I didn't have empathy for a long time. I had to be trained in me, you know, through my schooling, and it's still something I'm working on. I consider it one of my weaker points. You know, it's a tough one. Yeah. It's tough to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, because all we have is our own experience. All we have to compare to anything is our own experience. So it's difficult to put yourself in their position, or even try and mind read and see what is going on in someone else's mind without asking. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But I think it is a capacity that, you know, we can develop, and like you said, maybe it's not a communication thing, it's more of a felt thing, you know, maybe more tied in with our limbic system and my emotional centers in my brain tying in with your emotional centers. And again, back to vibration and frequency, right? When you're feeling sad and depressed and down, but you're not saying anything about it, I can still pick up off of that a little bit because, maybe you're giving off pheromones, hormones, things in the air that my receptors are picking off of and interpreting, or maybe I'm sensing a certain frequency or vibration that you're putting off,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Also know, like body language is definitely a big part of, human communication.
Sure. And macro and micro expressions on the face too. We're great at picking up like little twitches in the eyes and smiles and things like that. Oh, here comes my co-host. Tank just got out of the cancer treatment hospital today, and we got this tumor removed from his hip a little while ago, and then just got some testing done today, and he's as far as we know cancer free in all of his internal organs, and we're super happy about that. He's a little lethargic, but he came down to join the show, and these are my two co-hosts. So okay, cool. So let's get into. I want to start talking about geometry a little bit, because that was the last thing that you and I were really riffing on the mats the other day.
Yeah.
And I hope we have a lot more conversation. Jiu-Jitsu is one of those things where it's great to go and get the training, but we get so much more from just being there around each other, and we spend a lot of time before and after the practices talking and getting to know each other, and I find it so enriching in so many different ways. Anyway, so getting onto the geometric piece. So I brought up sacred geometry a couple times on the podcast. Things like the flower of life, Metatron's cube, and Fibonacci spirals and things like that, and how these geometric patterns tend to show up in nature and in the cosmos on both macro and micro scales, like all the way to the size and shapes of galaxies, all the way down to the size and shape of photons and gluons and how they interact and move and things like that. And I just want to know, what are your specific interests in the geometrical shape or how geometry plays into reality and the structure of reality?
I think my main interest in this, like the geometric structure of reality, is finding like like that perspectiveless perspective. So if you know how reality builds itself, you can like learn some sort of like universal truth in that way.
About yourself too. Because if you can find out how the universe builds itself and structures itself, then you know how you build yourself and structure yourself. Yeah. I think my interest in there is a little selfish in that I want to use it as sort of like a biohack or a life hack, right? Where if I can figure out how the universe makes planets and stars and stuff, then maybe I can, change some molecular structure in my body with my mind.
Yeah. One of my favorite things to tell people too is that so we know portals exist. And
I just heard something about scientists thinking that black holes were portals to different universes. Is this what you're talking about, or portals to different dimensions, or what?
No, this is actually they're called electromagnetic X points. And so you can Google it and it's on there. Basically, it's on NASA's website. There's these points that intersect points between like the sun and the Earth's electromagnetic fields. That where they cross, basically supercharged particles coming off the sun go through these portals and travel the millions of miles instantly to hit the Earth's atmosphere.
So almost like wormholes.
Yeah, exactly, wormholes.
Okay.
That it basically instantaneous travel between 2 points.
So is it like the old theories of folding time and space with these portals, or do they have any theories on the structure of the portal itself?
No, they don't. They're still trying to study them, is what the article says. The University of Iowa. From the article, it says that it's it's something to do with the interaction between the electromagnetic fields. So
Interesting.
but they're completely invisible and you don't really see them. But so they're really hard to study. So they're trying to develop ways to like predict where they'll be or how to detect them so they can study them further.
So is this these portals? What's getting them interested in the portal? I mean, the portal itself is interesting, but someone's got to have some sort of thought of like maybe space travel faster than the speed of light or something.
Faster than the speed of light.
Okay,
Travel,
so that's what they're trying
basically.
to. Okay,
Yeah.
nice.
I mean, that's what I find so crazy about this story is that it is real. Like it happens. So it's not like physically impossible. So now that it's possible, like how do you do it? This kind of thing. And I feel like that's one of the, if you know the structure of the universe, or if you can understand what matter really is. So like going into, I believe in the vacuum. It's been referred to as like the ether before, but just empty space, and what that exactly is. I think that all structure of the universe is derived from empty space.
So you're talking about the stuff between the stuff.
Yeah.
The stuff that we think we can measure, matter and planets and, this pen and this, this can of soda or whatever. You're talking about everything, all the space in between. Yeah.
So there's this thing, have you heard the Planck's constant?
Yes.
So the Planck's constant is basically, it turns the electromagnetic spectrum, it's not smooth, it's a step function. So there's only certain, so in the visual spectrum, there's only certain electromagnetic energy states that can be occupied. So yeah, right there, it's the ultraviolet catastrophe. Is that if a photon could occupy every possible energy level, by the time it gets to the ultraviolet spectrum, it'd be infinite energy. And so, yeah, Max Planck, he kind of fudged the numbers. He just put in a number that made the calculations match what we actually see, and that's what the Planck's constant is. But basically how I read that is that all matter, so everything made of energy, and we know mass and energy are interchangeable. So all mass and energy are multiples of the Planck's constant. And so why that matters to me is that everything in between those energy levels is what I would call vacuum. It's the insulator. So it's what keeps everything. It has to overcome that insulator to jump to the next energy level. So it's just the same like an electric circuit or whatever, like they like put air gaps in a circuit, and so that
So the conduction is better?
Well, no, it's so that the voltage difference has to be so big before it can actually jump.
It's like an action potential.
Yeah, exactly. It's
an
exactly an action potential.
Yeah, so a certain amount of energy has to be built up before overcoming this barrier, this insulating layer, to reach the next one. Yep,
and I think that that's all of reality is that, but that it's a. I don't think that the electromagnetic spectrum, goes up into like X-rays and then goes down, or microwaves and stuff, and then goes down to infrared and higher wavelengths to lower wavelengths.
Yeah, that entire spectrum is interesting. If the listeners just want to Google that, light spectrum, you'll see a big diagram that's really, quite long, and then it'll have this little sliver on the the part of the spectrum that we can actually perceive with our inborn senses. We have equipment and stuff that can sense things out a little bit further, but still there's a lot of in between all those different demarcations along the spectrum. So yeah, you're postulating that, and I've heard this a couple places before too, but very interesting, that the space in between the stuff, that is what really makes up the universe. I mean, and it makes sense. The matter that we know of in the universe occupies 2% of everything, and then 98% is empty space. Well, it makes a lot more sense that the majority would be holding that structure in place more so than the 2% is, right?
And that's where I think the sacred geometry comes in, is that the flower of life is literally the structure of the vacuum.
Interesting. I'm wondering if I'd love to hear from like a structural engineer or something, and if he could take a look at he or she could take a look at some of the geometric patterns and shapes of like the flower of life and the Fibonacci spiral, and just test to see if those are like some of the strongest shapes structurally. So maybe the shape of the flower of the life, the specific curvature of the lines can hold a lot more capacity than maybe a skinnier oval or something.
Mm-hmm.
That'd be interesting.
Yeah.
So I want to jump back to the portals just for a second, because that's super interesting.
Yeah.
So the portals that you're talking about are different from black holes that we're studying?
Yes.
Okay, that's what I thought, because as far as I've heard, scientists believe that if we went towards a black hole thinking it was a portal, once we reach the event horizon, we would be completely ripped apart, and we don't know what happens after that, right?
Yeah.
So we don't know if you would travel through the hole and end up somewhere else in like a different location, different multiverse, universe, whatever. The black hole is sort of a big question mark, whereas the portals, it sounds like now they think that it does lead to a direct location somewhere else out in space. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So if you traveled through it, you would actually end up somewhere.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think the thing is, like, you could, like, why it's not really useful and maybe not big news or whatever is that basically if you took one of these portals that are near Earth, you just end up right in the sun, and that's not exactly a place you want to be.
Right.
You know, so it doesn't really work that way, and it might be that you need these massive electromagnetic fields interacting to actually, it's like you're going from one place of interaction to another place of interaction between the same electromagnetic fields.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I interpret that. So one of the things that article talks about is that the aurora borealis, the green lights we see, is actually maybe this the stream of ultra excited particles that portaled here from the sun, and that's why they're very excited and hitting, and why we can see them. Interesting.
I just watched, if you haven't seen this already, I think it's on Netflix, called One Strange Rock with Will Smith. So Will Smith narrates this documentary series about the planet Earth, and honestly, it's based off of this whole idea of perspective, right? So he talks about he interviews these eight astronauts who spent over thousands of days in space, and how being away from the Earth has changed their perspective of what life on Earth means, and what that the Earth is a giant organism in and of itself, and how it's changed that perspective. But yeah, they talk about what you were just referring to in the show. It's pretty cool. Yeah. So yeah, the aurora borealis, that I think in the show they said that it was maybe sunbursts coming off the sun, right? Like a big burst of energy that actual like radiation coming to the Earth, and then reacting with particles in our atmosphere to create the colors and the waves and the movement. So yeah, but you're bringing in a whole other aspect of the idea of how did they get here, the transportation method, right? Did they just travel over long periods of time and space to get here, or were they portaled here somehow? Is that what you're...
Yeah. That's what the article brings up. That's a possibility. Okay. I don't think they're not saying that's like for sure what it is, but I think they've definitely said that could definitely explain that phenomenon.
Interesting. So talk more about what you think the ether, and to the listeners, we're not talking about the drug ether. We're talking about ether spelled with an A, A-E-T-H-E-R, but this is a term that's been used to sort of describe this in-between space that we don't know much about it at all. I mean, we've taken I think microwave radiation pictures of the Big Bang and been able to see microwave radiation from billions of years ago, and that kind of shows us what looks like neurons in a brain. That's pretty cool, and the connections between matter. And then we also have different ways to take pictures of the space in universe using X-rays and things like that as well, but not much. We're still, on the fence and don't know much about, things like dark matter and dark energy and how these play into the nothingness, right? So can you speak a little bit to what you know about that? About how you think about it, the emptiness?
So I was going back to what I believe in relation theory. I don't know if you ever... It's kind of like it's part of like general relativity and stuff like that. That like you can't define an object singularly by itself. It's always that object's relation to everything else. Mm-hmm. So like one of the things to me is like by describing night, you inherently describe what day is too. They're co-defining. Mm-hmm. So like for light to exist, darkness also has to exist. You see,
mm-hmm. It's a balance.
It's a balance, yeah, and it's like the yin yang theory.
Yeah, almost like have you ever seen those pictures of like there's a white vase in the middle, but then in the empty space, the black space is two faces looking at each other, right? So they mm-hmm. both define each other. The different spaces do, yeah. And you can't have one without the other.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So from that, I think you can make the argument that because something exists, nothing has to exist, like co-defining in that way. Mm. And, you know, it's like the concept of zero, how that was very revolutionary for math.
Yeah, talk about that a little bit. You were telling me a little bit about the history of the number zero.
Oh, yeah. I read it a long time ago. It's a book called The Origin of Zero, I think. And it talks about how that basically, you know, because the ancient Greeks, they didn't have a zero in their numerical system.
You just started with the numeral 1.
Yep. And so, but, you know, as you know, like, especially with a lot of algebra and, like, you know, setting a function equal to 0, like how that helps you solve the function. Mm-hmm. So you can see where x lies or where y lies when x is 0. Mm-hmm.
Again, relationalism.
Yeah. So, like, the concept of 0 was kind of, like, discovered. And before that, you were limited in what math you could do. And so now we, like, you know, 0 is fundamental to our whole understanding.
It's almost a center or cornerstone.
Yeah.
What about like things like negative numbers? Did they have those before 0, or was that a concept afterwards? I wonder if that was a progression off of the discovery of 0, or if that was there beforehand, and then all of a sudden we discovered this nothingness piece, like right in between negative and positive numbers.
I think there is a concept, like, you know, it's like you owe me 5 apples, but you only have 3 apples now, so you owe me 2 apples later. That's kind of like a negative number mm-hmm. in terms of, like, you know, bartering like transaction.
Balance, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So maybe in that sense they have a concept, like, you know, we've always had a concept of negative.
But there was no concept of, like, hey, we're square, we're at 0.
Oh,
you
yeah.
know? Like, I paid you off, you know? Huh, that's interesting. I wonder how that factored into people's minds back then when they were buying and selling and paying up debts. Okay, so go on. The history of 0. So they discover it, and
I believe it was in like the Arab world was what discovered 0. But you know, but basically it's very fundamental in, you know, math now, and I think that the idea, like the concept of 0, plays into nothingness. You know, right? That's what the idea is, and that I think that's like a physical quality as well. Is that there's nothingness in this universe, which I think you can see when you look up in space. There's a whole bunch of black and, you know, dots of stars here and there. Mm-hmm. You know, like we were talking about earlier, is that most of the universe is empty space. Dark matter, dark energy.
What we think is nothingness, what we think is empty, actually contains a whole hell of a lot.
Yeah.
There's a lot of data in that nothingness. Okay?
So what's interesting is that so I take the idea of the Planck's constant, everything being multiple, so everything in between is the vacuum. Mm-hmm. So there's this mathematician named George Cantor who had the idea of that there's 2 different types of infinites. So there's actually a larger and a smaller infinite. And so what he was saying is that there's like listable, or they call it countable, but it's better to understand it as listable infinites, and then there's unlistable infinites. So the Planck's constant would be a listable infinite because it's all multiples of the Planck's constant.
It's definable.
Or L energy, or energy is a listable infinite. But the vacuum is actually an unlistable infinite. So it's a bigger infinite than physical matter is.
Because it's undefinable.
Yeah.
As of yet.
Well, it's unlistable. You can always make the list bigger. So, and you can look at George Cantor, and it's like a whole proof. The way I found out about it is this number file YouTube channel. they break down like pretty cool like math concepts and everything. But pretty much you can always add a new number so basically how it breaks down is the cardinal numbers, 1, 2, 3 to infinity, and going the other way into negative infinity. That's a listable infinite. They're countable. But the amount of values possible between 0 and 1 is an unlistable infinite, or a bigger infinite.
Because it would go on forever.
Yeah, the thing is you can always add like a 0 in between all the numbers, and then now that's a different number from the listed number below it.
Wow.
So I apply that to the Planck's constant, and that says that so matter and energy is a smaller infinite than the vacuum between it. And so that could be a way to describe why it would have so much more inherent energy, is because it can occupy infinitely more energy levels than matter can.
I mean, that spurs questions in my mind of potentials for extracting infinite amounts of energy from that space, but also, I think there's infinite positives that could come from that, but also an infinite amount of negative things, disastrous things that could come from it as well.
Yeah.
So we need to be wary of those infinites as well. Having an inherent creative or constructive quality versus a destructive quality. Yeah, when you talk about nothingness, my mind immediately goes to my background and training in Buddhism. And in Buddhism, one of the major theories that they espouse is that, that we are essentially empty. We're, and metaphysics and physics is proving this these days, and quantum physics and stuff is showing that, this flesh suit that I call a body right now, that I think is solid and physical, again, just like the rest of the universe, it's 99% empty space.
Yeah.
Every single atom in my body is 99% empty space. What I'm seeing and what I'm touching and what I can feel and what feels like I can't pass my fingers through is just empty space. The majority of it. And that's what Buddhists have been saying for a long, long time, many thousands of years. And, the Dalai Lama said once, and I'm brought to this again because of what you said about empty space, this nothingness and the concept of zero. Someone asked him, how do I turn my negative thinking into positive thinking? And the Dalai Lama said, well, you can't just go from a negative mind state to a positive mind state. You have to find the space between the mind states first in order to make the transition.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, you can't just jump from one to the other, but you have to find like a baseline mental state. So if you're feeling really sad, you go into meditation and dissolve the emotion of sadness, right? So then you have no emotion. It's just empty or void of emotion. It's almost like a neutral space. And then from there you can build on or jump to a positive mindset or a positive emotion. So he says that you have to have this neutral space in between for that transition to happen, that you can't just go from one to the other. And that makes a lot of sense with this zero theory, right? That it's a necessity, and the nothingness is a necessity. The structure in between is a necessity for either of the extremes to happen in the first place. So then, when you brought this idea to my attention, it brought me back to some of my psychedelic experiences with ketamine and going into what people call K-holes, where I'm totally disassociated from my body. And I've had a couple visionary experiences where my question going in was just to be open and to show me the workings of the universe. So like, just show me how it works. And I've been shown a lot of different metaphorical images, but they all give me the sense or the feeling that the substance, the true nature of consciousness and what I'm looking for to experience as a human being is everything in between. It's not not the things that we think it is. We're studying the wrong things. That's the message that I'm getting. And then we need to look inside. We need to look in between, read between the lines, if you could say that too.
Yeah.
But yeah, when you brought that to me, I think in people out there hearing this right now, and thinking about themselves and who they think they are as a physical being, I think might have their whole concept of self flipped on its head. You know, when you can admit and acknowledge that it's a fact that you are 99% empty space, then what does that leave? Then what are you?
Yeah.
If you are 0.00001% of what you think you are, what does that make you? Does that make you a human? Does that make you a spirit or a soul? Does that make you worthwhile? Does that make you of value to the entire cosmos? Like, what is that? What?
Yeah.
It's a big thing you bring to the table. You know, it can disrupt a lot of people's sense of self, but I think it's a healthy thing that you bring it to the table because it's the truth. It is what science is showing us, and unfortunately, the masses are not educated to a lot of these concepts.
Yeah. Well, you know what I run into when I try to like talk to this about some people is, I get the feeling that some people like genuinely don't really care. You know, they don't really care what the structure of the universe is. They don't, you know, it's just not something they're interested in. And
I find that too.
Yeah. So, you know, it's one of those things I don't really get it because, like, you know, the structure, you live in the universe. Why wouldn't you want to understand it? You know, and it's like, you know, like personal difficulties too. Like, there's untold, like, you know, benefit to knowing how the world works better. You know.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Again, like they're life hacks.
Yeah.
Right. The more you know, the more agency you can have over making and creating change for yourself. Whether it's on a level you can see and sense, or if it's on a metaphysical, vibrational level, right? We have so much more impact over healing, over performance, over mood states, emotion states, over how we process things. We have a lot more control over that than we give ourselves credit for. Yeah. You know, and I think a lot of people are just sort of either don't care or are oblivious to those superpowers that they have. Yeah. Or have never been taught or educated that they have those things available to them, or that that's even a thing to study. You know, I think that's unfortunate. And that's kind of what I'm trying to do with this podcast is begin to open a few minds up to the possibility that they are so much more than they think they are, right? And that their potential is endless. It's really cool. So what this concept of geometry, I'm right on board with you there, that, you know, it's not only the structure of things like sacred geometry, Metatron's cube, and flower of life and stuff, but it's the space in between that's holding it together. Mm-hmm. So I'm right on board with you there. Do you think that we can apply any of these geometrical theories to the structure of the universe to more ethereal concepts that may not be able to be measured by, you know, the tools that we have now? So like we can apply sacred geometry to plant life, right? So we can look at a sunflower and see the Fibonacci spiral in the you know, how it blooms, and we can see this all throughout all sorts of different nature. And you know, the Fibonacci, you know, the golden ratio in like the thorax of ants, and like how our limbs are all, you know, according to a specific mathematical structure. Do you think we can apply this to concepts like the mind or emotion or perception itself, things that don't necessarily have a definable structure per se, but I don't know. I think that could be interesting. I don't think I've ever heard of anybody applying some of these concepts to things like that.
Well, so one of the things I'd say is like what I think the flower of life is like how, because you know, light travels in straight lines. It always propagates in straight lines anyway. But we always think of it as like a single beam, like a laser being shot through two, you know, slits or something like that. But what light really is it propagates in spheres. So it's straight lines that move in spheres is what I think like the macro interaction of photons is. And so that's what the flower of life is when you look at it, it's straight lines within a sphere, and that sphere grows like a fractal. They're like tetrahedrons, you know, all those straight lines, they build the double tetrahedron.
It's like a ripple effect.
Yeah. But, you know, we know that light, it's not just, you know, lasers are a straight beam of, you know, energetic photons, but like this lamp over here, it's actually the light it's propagating in a sphere.
We also know that light doesn't always go in a straight line, right? Like if it goes through an exceptionally strong magnetic field or a black hole or something, it'll bend.
It'll bend, but space-time bends with it. That's the thing about general relativity, is that everything, it's not, light isn't just the only thing bending, space-time is bending with it. So relative to that space-time, it's still traveling straight.
Sure. So if you're in that curve at the moment, it would still seem like it's going straight.
Yeah, because everything else is curving with it.
Sure.
But how I was saying it connects to the metaphysical is that, these are just photons propagating, and photons are known as they're like the force carrier for electrons, the electromagnetic field. So like between two electrons, that force, or like the force of me and my finger, that repulsive force, the electromagnetic force, what carries those that force, the force part, the carrying force particle is photons, is light. So I think of consciousness, to me, is defined as like the action potential, the electrochemical signal in your brain. It would seem to me that consciousness would be more the the electrical side of it than the chemical, just because I can input different chemicals, but the electrical impulse is the thing that gets excited and that's inherent in the neuron. So I consider my consciousness to be like just a complex net of electrical impulses, and that's what I consider to be me. So I would see that if that's how photons propagate in this reality, I imagine that affects how, since the photons are the same structure in my brain, that they the signal possibly propagates like that as well.
Very interesting. I like the perspective that you take with, you bring in electrochemical reactions, right? Both. But then you separate out electrical and chemical, and, they are interwoven in electrochemical reactions, but almost like the chemical is the output or the outcome of the electric storm that's happening, right? But is that electric current, does that hold substance itself, or is that part of that empty space ether? And if your consciousness and who you think you are in that sense is this electric storm or the action potential, are you the electrical current that crosses that gap, or are you that gap itself?
That's an interesting question. We have to travel through the you have to travel through the vacuum to go anywhere. Like even physically, I would say. So we're electrons interacting with the vacuum, and maybe it's that interaction that's us. Is that both of them are? Is that going in between? That we're coded. So one of the things, and I brought up a quote of it. I was just reading a recent article about space-time, and this one Brian Swingle, he wrote in a 2018 annual review of condensed matter physics. He was postulating that space-time and gravity ultimately emerged from something else. So he's talking about that, they're not the inherent structure of the universe, that it'd be derived from something else. It's the
result of something.
Yeah.
It's the result of some other interaction.
Interesting. And he argues that it's actually quantum entanglement is the interaction. But, quantum entanglement's it's produced by the same source, but, it'll interact even over vast distances.
That's opening up a whole new can of worms. So let's get into that in the next segment. For you listeners out there, we're going to take a quick commercial break, and we'll be right back with segment 2 with Patrick. All right, folks, for you on YouTube, you get to see a little bit of behind the scenes as I rehash this GoPro. All right, segment 2, folks. All right, we're back from our commercial break with Patrick Gorman for segment number 2 of episode 45, Conversations with the Mind. So we left off trying to still define, using biochemistry a little bit, what consciousness could be as it fits into this model, right? So we were talking about action potentials, and these are the processes, the electrochemical processes that happen between neurons in the brain and in the body. Where it will build up a certain amount of energy before it has some sort of electrical current that gets sent to the next neuron, and that's how it sort of communicates along this chain and initiates action, whether it's thought action or recall memory action or physical action in our muscles and things like that. But you were saying that the electrochemical signaling at the beginning of the potential as well as at the outcome of the potential when it lands on that other neuron, that these two endpoints, these nodal points, this is really what we've been focusing our study on in a lot of biochemistry, I think, is what goes into the interaction and what comes off the interaction, right? But there's this gap in between where that energy transfers from one to the other, and that it could be this space in between that, this movement of energy from one to another that could be what actually, life is, or consciousness is, or the perpetuation of energy or the perpetuation of potential is really what's going on, literally. But that could be the essence of what consciousness is. And you were just about to get into quantum entanglement and how that relates to this as well. Yeah.
So in that article that Swingle, Brian Swingle, I think I said, he was talking about quantum entanglement and how that he thinks that the gravity and space-time are derived from it. And so he was kind of talking about that instantaneous communication that is implied, that it's actually it's traveling through a substance. That's why it's faster than light.
Like a conductor, almost like if you were to run electricity through water, it's a better conductor than electricity through air.
Yeah. Right?
So this ether substance is maybe composed of something else or thicker. It's a better conductor.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so that's like what he was trying to explain, because it is like faster than light communication. So that's what I think too, is like there seems to be a debate about whether things can go faster than the speed of light when we seem to have already shown that.
And that's why, was it Einstein who called it spooky action at a distance?
I think it was Niels Bohr. Or something like that.
But Einstein had his own theories too, and he thought it was a weird occurrence. When you manipulate one atom that has been entangled with another atom all the way across the planet, that they seem to have reactions simultaneously.
Yeah, so when you change the spin of one particle, the spin of the other particle changes too at the same time.
Instantaneously. Not even like a microsecond afterwards, but simultaneously.
Yeah.
And they're saying, quantum physicists will say that these particles have been entangled quantumly. So you affect one and it happens to the other one.
Yeah.
You're saying that there may be some other theories around that too.
Yeah. What I think it is, and like they don't really bring up vacuum, but is that it travels through the vacuum, that the actual structural space, that it's through a substrate that's like not dependent on space or time, and that's why it seems instantaneous to us, because it's independent of time.
Almost interdimensional.
Yeah, literally interdimensional. Going into what I really think about the electromagnetic spectrum and how this all plays into this is what I think, and this is like counter to Big Bang Theory and like origins of the universe and everything, but what I think it is that energy is coming through stars from a higher dimension, and it's releasing energy into this dimension, and energy is constantly being absorbed, re-emitted, until it gets to a lower energy level. That's what we call entropy. Is that this constant going to a lower energy level until it gets trapped into a black hole, and a black hole is just the opposite of a sun, and that it's energy going down into the next dimensional level, the next fractal level of reality.
So the energy coming through stars, maybe being transported, right, through portals or through some other substrate coming through, and it's almost like the star is an expression, or it's like a generator, right? That's channeling this energy through and putting it out into our 3D dimension. But then you with the black holes, if it's going, if it maybe are the black holes the collectors of energy, right? Because everything that goes into it,
everything falls in,
right?
Not even light escapes the event horizon. That's why it's black. There's this thing. It's called Hawking radiation. It's theoretical, completely theoretical. So Stephen Hawking was working on it. He did a lot of work on most of his work on black holes. But it's this theoretical radiation that has to come out of a black hole because the conservation of matter, right? Like what for entropy is like, matter can be neither created nor destroyed. It only changes form. So that's why there's this theoretical Hawking radiation, is that there's information going into this black hole. So something has to come back out to conserve, to keep the conservation of energy in this closed system as they consider our universe. So if information's going in, it has to come back out, but they don't see any Hawking radiation. We've never measured it. It's purely theoretical. I don't think that there is any information coming out, because I think our universe isn't a closed system, it's an open system. And it's an open system that flows into the next universe. That's
the next dimensional
space, yeah. And it kind of plugs into what I was talking about, action potential as well, because how energy comes from like the upper level and comes to our lower level is because it overcomes that action potential between the vacuum or the insulator between the two dimensions. And the reason I think that is the Planck's constant, going back to that one, is that the reason why that's the smallest unit of measurement possible in our reality, basically, is that it's the smallest divisible thing that interacts with our universe, is pretty much what it's saying. So what I think that black hole is, it's going into, it's going past the Planck's constant to the next possible energy levels.
Sure.
Down.
So then each dimension would contain different energy levels, different frequency bands.
Yep.
Right? And what I'm imagining now is you almost have to imagine the universe, well, for me anyway, I almost have to imagine the universe as like a flat disc, like a pancake that has some depth to it a little bit, but then multiple universes stacked on top of each other, like if you were to stack up Oreos, right? And then stacks slices of Swiss cheese, and then each of the holes in the Swiss cheese is like these black hole portals, or portals through suns into the higher level or the lower level dimension. Yeah. Right? That's so interesting because I think it plays very nicely into the idea of how people have found like 11 different dimensions happening simultaneously in the same space, but that maybe these universes are not stacked on top of each other but layered within each other, right? And that they're happening all around us all the time, but we just cannot pick up on them. We don't have the sensory organs or the capabilities to do so, and then maybe psychedelics allow us, or meditation can allow us to tap into or see these dimensional spaces, these other frequency bands, and almost create our own little individual wormholes for at least 12 hours at a time. Interesting. What is your take on, or do you know anything about the study of cymatics, or have you ever heard of that? So cymatics is the study of like sound and frequency and vibration on matter. So they'll vibrate water, or they'll vibrate sand on like a metal plate, and with different frequency or hertz ranges, it will create geometrical patterning. Every time you hit like 433 hertz and or whatever, it'll create that specific shape. Oh yeah. Right. So you've seen demonstrations like that, and that's it's been around for a long time, but it's picking up a lot more in interest in the research realm, and I'm interested to see where the science goes. No, I mean, we've known for a long time that everything is energy, and that everything is frequency and vibration of that energy. Even thoughts, our thoughts, once thought of as just these, free-floating things, actually have vibration that go out of our skull, that leave our skull when we have a thought. We can measure this on EEGs and things, brainwave states and things like this. So, we're literally shooting thought beams out of our head that are interacting with the vibration and frequency of matter all around us, and with you and your body and with my dog, and so the power of our thoughts really takes on a whole new dimension, right? When we know that our thoughts have this quality.
Yeah, they're like tangible in a way.
Exactly. So a positive thought, and it's just like a lock and key mechanism. A positive thought will have a very specific vibration that will only be received by the same frequency, the same shape, the same patterning, right? And that's what will be reflected back to you. So that's what we mean by like the law of attraction or the secret or manifesting
Like
things.
resonance, right?
Exactly, resonance. So you put positive things out into the universe, you get positive things back, right? You put out negative things out into the universe, you get negative things back. And that this goes back to the direct study of frequency and vibration. I'm really interested to hear what you think about this too, but also where the science is going to take us as far as like, how far can we break down our understanding of reality and consciousness and matter, knowing that all these things are simply vibrations. They're all essentially the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, what do you think?
Oh, I definitely think everything is just a type of vibration and frequency.
Mm-hmm.
That's my whole thing about looking at the electromagnetic spectrum. It's like, it defines so much of our reality, and it's like just a small slice of it. But all of that is, there's frequency, there's wavelength, and that's how we determine and like separate and define the different parts of it.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, sorry, I lost my train of thought.
That's okay. What particularly interests you about like quantum physics and metaphysics? Because a lot of quantum physics is this vibration and frequency stuff.
All right. What interests me about it?
Yeah. What's particularly interesting to you? Because for me, like quantum entanglement was a huge, like, big, interesting thing. For you, not so much.
Yeah.
But what are your particular interests in the field?
Well, I like the idea of like that you can find some sort of pattern in the frequency and wavelength and how they propagate, and like this like base algorithm to how the world works. I feel like it's deeply rooted in understanding frequency, wavelength, and how things interact like that. Like interference patterns, and like how two waves interact with each other is kind of like how everything, like we were saying, that this is electromagnetic force. I'm not actually touching this table. There's this repulsive force here, but it's kind of dictated by those the polarity and like the rotation of those electromagnetic fields.
Man, when I was a kid, I knew about that that interaction when I was a kid, and I used to play these mean games with my brother where I'd be like messing with him or poking him or giving him noogies or whatever, and he'd yell to my mom, "Shane won't stop touching me," and I was like, "I'm not actually touching you, there's space in between our fingers." And being right about that when I was a kid. Yeah, so that's interesting. Quantum physics is so vast. We're only scratching the surface.
Well, and I've looked at it too, because like pretty much quantum physics is the standard model, and the standard model it's pretty much just like a list of how particles interact with each other, and it's like all empirically found. So pretty much what quantum physics is just this huge table of like
interactions.
Math. That's written in math that looks alien basically. Well, to me anyway. It's like I don't even know what level math it is, but I'm sure it's crazy. But just like a bunch of symbols and stuff. But basically, like from what I'm told, it's just listing out how these particles interact with each other based on experiments people have done, and that's why it's always like counterintuitive on how, like the whole causality. I don't know if you've seen in the news recently. They're talking about how they think you can make a virtual particle go backwards in time, and how they can find the measurement of something before they even measure it.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Tell me more about that.
So it's like they've been doing experiments where like you can find a measurement even before you even do the measurement. It's like this weird. It's one of the like spooky properties of this like study of quantum physics.
It's like a predictability.
Yeah, or that causality is going the other way, or that time isn't flowing the same way that it does for us. That maybe like time isn't as smooth, as we think. It's not the smooth trudging forward.
It's not linear.
It's not linear, and that maybe at the very, very small, it travels backwards sometimes.
I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. In Buddhist philosophy, again, I always go back to Buddhist philosophy. They believe that past, present, and future are all existing simultaneously.
Yeah.
Right, and we have the ability to time travel. We can literally do it. I mean, in our minds. We've taken functional brain imaging of people in visualization versus people actually in the experience, and the brain doesn't know the difference. You can literally trick the brain into believing that you're doing something by doing your own imagery with it, as long as it's realistic in your mind, right? So that's why we can get mental reps by running through a Judo or Jiu-Jitsu technique over and over and over in our mind. As long as we do it, we trick our brain into thinking that we're actually doing it on the mat. So it's very interesting. I forgot where I was going with that, but yeah, that's so fascinating. Yeah, where was I going with that? Buddhism, past, present, and future. Yeah, so they believe that you could time travel by thinking about a past memory and then making it so real in your mind that you have the ability to go back into that time and space and affect change somehow with a developed skill set, or go into some future, right? Which is pretty interesting.
That'd be really cool.
Yeah. So I think the power of the mind is fascinating, and it goes beyond the brain for sure. The brain is just some tool. It's an amazing tool, and maybe it's like a frequency modulator or a filter or something that sort of, or a tuning fork that tunes these frequencies.
It's like the hardware for the software of our consciousness.
Right. But I think the mind space or consciousness space, which could be the same or could be different also, is where we can really, really make some awesome changes and strides in humanity and our evolution if we can figure out how to engage with it a little bit better.
So I've heard that like Buddhism really supports the like simulation theory, or I've heard that said before. And like one of the really interesting things I find about simulation theories, I don't know if you ever heard Elon Musk's argument for that the chance we're in base reality is like 1 in billions. So that like statistically speaking, we're probably in a simulation right now. One of the other things I found very interesting about that is the Open AI project he has. They have this one. They had an issue where they wanted to. They have a robotic arm that they want to teach to how to manipulate objects in real life. But they were trying to program an artificial intelligence to like learn faster, but what they were noticing is that it wasn't manipulating the square very well, and it wasn't learning very quickly. Especially when you compare it to like a human baby who's never touched anything, but we all have inherent manipulation of our extremities that they were even having trouble programming in a robot. One of the ways they overcame that was this concept of changing the domain. So what it basically entails is that they run simulations where like they change the domain. So like they change the size of the hand manipulating. They change the size of the cube. They change the gravity of that world. They change the color. They change every little physical aspect of it, and then they run all of those simulations simultaneously, like in the for the artificial intelligence to try all those different combinations. And when they did that, the robot was learning way faster, and almost had like an inherent understanding of how to manipulate the cube.
So again, maybe the human brain is able to hold in its space all the different potentialities and all the different things that could happen if it was different with all these different variables, and it's able to hold that simultaneously into this one cohesive model. to where it can learn. Yeah, maybe the robots are unable to make those things come together, and it can probably do these things separately very well, but then when they combine them, it did it very well.
Yeah.
Almost human-like.
And it's really interesting, like, if we live in a simulation in this, like, multiple dimensional theory, is that there's all these universes that are coexisting that are all these just, like, slightly different changes in, like, you know, the level of gravity or the balance of matter to antimatter, you know, like, all those different possibilities exist simultaneously, just like in this simulation that they're building. Because, you know, like, so when they put, like, an AI to learn, like, StarCraft or a video game or something, how it got to, like, superhuman level ability is because it ran, like, billions and billions of games, you know. It was playing, like, 1,000 games a second or something, because it could just speed up the time in that virtual world. But you can't speed up the time in physical world, you know, for that robot manipulating a physical object.
But with things like quantum computers and things like that, you probably could run simulations that are getting pretty close to what a human brain can do.
Oh, yeah. It's actually, the argument is that the brain is like a kind of quantum computer.
Right. Where it can work out all these simulations before they happen and then choose a pathway to take. Yeah. And I bring this up in other podcasts too, that I think, as far as we know, human beings might be the only creature on this planet anyway that can run those type of simulations and then take a directive course of action. I think animals are more instinctively based, they're more reactionary, more reflexive in nature, and more linear in their thinking. We might in the future see, you know, things in animals like orcas, like whales, and dolphins, where they can communicate with each other and hunt together and strategize amongst each other as a unit, versus working independently. We might start to see things like that as well. But as far as I know, we're the only creature that has that ability to run simulations. You know, our brain is far different than most other animals, most other mammals or reptiles or anything.
Yeah.
But with the simulation, you know, even with that theory, right? So say we are in a simulation, and it's a very complex simulation, right? A lot of different codes running right now to make this happen. But every simulation has to start with the first line of code, right? So then, whether this is a simulation or not a simulation, the first line of code for existence of consciousness could be that initial frequency, that initial vibration that happened somewhere in the universe, in one of the universes, that sparked, you know, these ripple effects through the flower of life, like you said, fractalizing out, creating more frequencies and vibrations, and now they're interacting with each other as they ripple off each other. But there was that one original frequency, that one original spark of energy and frequency. And if we could trace it back to that and find out what that is, I think that might unlock so many different things for us to explore. Don't you think?
Yeah. You know what it reminds me of is the Hindu concept of Om.
Yeah, that's what I was just thinking too, that sound, Om.
The primordial sound.
Right.
Yeah.
And for the listeners out there who don't know that or aren't experiencing yoga or anything, if you see that symbol around, I'm sure you've all heard people say Om before, right? Maybe jokingly, but the way it's theorized is that sound, that frequency, is that original sound that pervades everything, and it's almost like imprinted on the metaphysical DNA of everything, right? And I'm not sure how monks utilize it as a tool, but I'm sure it can be utilized to do some really awesome things.
Yeah, I know it's a big part of chanting, right? And it's like to connect to the primordial sound and stuff like that.
But there's a lot of different mantras with different chants that use different frequencies.
Oh, okay.
If you get a chance, you should look up Tibetan throat singing.
Oh, okay.
It's really cool, like really deep. I wish I could do it. But they make these really cool vibrational sounds with their voice, and they do it at specific frequencies to do anything from, shamanic healing on people with sound and vibration. And we know that sound and frequency works for healing because we use it with ultrasounds all the time to break up, scar tissue and gallstones and kidney stones and stuff like that. So sound can heal in that sense. I've heard and seen, evidence of Tibetans using sound to levitate objects. using sound to do all sorts of crazy, cool things that we would think are impossible or miracles. But I just love this idea of studying sound and the idea of frequency and vibration and how that's making a comeback in science, right? I think it's been around for a long time as an idea.
It makes me, Tesla was a big thing about frequency and wavelength, and that was the end, because all of his experiments were with high frequency and trying to achieve high frequencies, which is what like the Tesla tower or Tesla coil and all that's originally for.
So in psychology, we have this idea of cognition, right? You know what that is, everyday thinking. And then we have another idea called metacognition, or thinking about thinking, right? Which is what we're doing a lot of in this conversation, right? We're doing a lot of talking and theorizing and thinking about how we think as humans and thought processes and thoughts themselves and, emotions and all these things. What is your take on, metacognition versus cognition? And what do you think about that? Do you think about metacognition at all?
Oh, yeah. Usually where my mind goes when I think of metacognition or thinking about thinking is logic and how we just how we structure our thoughts and this concept of truth and how all that applies to it.
And logic's a relatively new idea for the human species, right? Only a few thousand years old.
Yeah, it was written ancient Greek times,
right? And that's relatively
pretty much the origin of ours.
Yeah. So logic is a new way of thinking that we came up with, human beings came up with, and somehow organized our thoughts into greater coherency.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things I was reading, can't remember from what book. He was pointing out that we're all inherently logical beings, because to be able to identify something as food or to identify an object at all is you actually have to be able to reason. So we have this concept of edible foods, and then we have a concept of apple. And, within each of those concepts, when I think of apple, I think green, I think kind of shiny, I think of the shape, all those different concepts within that concept. And then I have all the, food, which is, taste and, nourishment, all that. And so you take that idea of apple and you take the concept of food and combine the two, and that's how you know to eat an apple. And so inherently we all are able to reason and connect concepts, because that's really all logic and thinking is that we take one concept in that relational theory that I was talking about earlier. That's a big part of philosophy and physics that I believe in, is that each concept is actually defined by all the other concepts around it. So, but that thinking is really just us making this huge web of concepts.
Well, and that's what I think scientific inquiry is too.
Yeah.
When someone comes up with a new theory in science, it doesn't come out of nothingness, right? It comes out, what do we say? I only came up with this theory because I was standing on the shoulders of giants, right? There's a whole lot of other things that have to come before for something to happen, and a lot of bad theories surrounding this one thing for a good theory to emerge out of it.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's really complicated. One of the things is math. Math is almost because it's the definition of quantifiable. It's but math is a highly logical practice. It's everything has to be rational. Everything is a step. Everything has to make sense. The things have to balance on each side of the equal sign. But then math sometimes, one of the questions is math always rational, or is math irrational at some point?
Irrational numbers.
Yeah. Or is it always make sense? Does one always equal one, or does one equal two sometimes? Is that a thing? Is math logically consistent? It was one of the major questions of math. I can't remember which mathematician, but he made a list of all the big questions that maybe may be unanswerable about math, and is math logically consistent always?
And for the listeners out there who might not be able to think of how does one possibly equal two, What popped in my head is, the slit experiment with particles.
Yeah.
Right? So they measured an atom going through this slit and took pictures of it or measurements of it. And they observed it in both a wave state and,
A particle.
Particle state, yeah.
Yeah.
And so it could be in either of those states simultaneously. And so the atom counted as one, but it can also count as one of each of these things in every moment. And so it's actually two different things in every given moment. So that's one example of how one can actually equal two things.
Yeah. And, there's like another one. I go through, I've been going through my old textbooks. I'm in an algebra. So I'm just like retaking some algebra lessons, just to brush up on it. And one of the identities that really bothers me is any number to the power of 0 equals 1. And then the identity that 0 to the power of 0 equals 1. And or 0 to any power equals 0, right? Those three identities, but when you put them together, that's contradictory, right? If you try to mix them, 0 to the power of 0 equals 1, and you can put it in your calculator, and a calculator will say that.
It's been programmed to say that.
It's been programmed to say that because there's an algorithm, but that doesn't make any sense to me. And it's like, it seems to go counterintuitive to what the concept of 0 actually is.
It's almost like whoever was coming up with these identities just wanted a quick, easy explanation.
Well, so there's actually a cool story about this. So the cubic formula, like the quadratic formula
equation.
Quadratic equation is for, x to the power of 2. Well, there's a cubic formula for, the power of 3. And it's actually the origin of the number I, the square root of -1. So that was actually developed in Italy in the 1600s by Italian mathematicians using the cubic formula. But what's really interesting about it is, so in those days, the way you would have a professor job at prestigious university is you would actually duel for the position. So
fight?
No, math duel.
Oh, math duel.
So what would you do is this guy would challenge the professor to a math duel. So he'd come up with 10 questions that he knows the answers to, and then the professor would come up with 10 questions he knows the answer to. They would exchange, and whoever answers them first correctly wins. And so if the challenger wins, he gets his job. So this whole cubic formula and the power of I, where this all came from was it was kind of like the nuclear option for all of these mathematicians, because it basically allowed them to solve problems that other mathematicians couldn't solve, so they could take anybody's job. But you think about that is this major development, the concept of I, all derived from these, highly competitive, people wanting their, job security. So, if you think about being in that, their objective isn't truth and finding out what conceptually is the square root of -1, because you can't put it on a number line. What is it? What are imaginary numbers? They weren't asking that. They were just, this solves the equation really quickly for me that someone else can't.
And the motive was not to further the knowledge base, but their motive was more selfish. It's more job security.
I would argue that, I don't know what the nature of their mind or what they actually thought, but it seems like, in that setting, in that environment, it might not be your primary objective. Your primary objective is job security, eating,
Well, I think of philosophical debate back in the time of Socrates and things like that, in Greek and Rome, and Greece and Rome, and how they would debate using logic. Some of them seeking truth, right? But others seeking power and position over other politicians and over other philosophers and things like that. So I think it happens not just in the field of math, but also in philosophy too. Anywhere where logic is applied, I think there's going to be people trying to use it in a manipulative way. Yeah. And there's going to be others who are seeking truth.
Oh man, the logical fallacies, how many of those people use in our current marketing campaigns?
I probably use a bunch of them automatically and I don't even know about it.
Yeah.
Joe's good at pointing out my illogical fallacies a lot of the time.
Yeah. Oh yeah, but they manipulate us all the time. It's like not being able to see the logically invalid argument because it's so convoluted. I feel like that's used against people all the time.
Sure. So logic back in the day was seen as like this great movement forward in human evolution or human consciousness, right? The ability to use logic. And I think since it was invented or since it was formalized, we've almost gotten to a point now where we're using logic too much, and it's almost to a detriment, because a lot of things are illogical, but also beautiful. A lot of creativity and imagination and movies that we see. The Avengers is an illogical movie, by any physics standards,
Yeah.
But it's those things that give us joy and meaning and, give people jobs to make those things. And, it sparks, like you said, ingenuity and imagination to do technical things and to solve even complex mathematical problems. So we need both. We need the creative, illogical sides of ourselves, but also the logical sides of ourselves. And I think, at least in the Western world, we're unfortunately boosting the logical side of ourselves, the intellectual side of ourselves, at the expense of our creative self or our emotional self.
Oh yeah,
and these
absolutely.
different parts of ourselves.
I think where that really comes through too is people like using science as almost a religion now.
Totally.
Like that if science can't prove it, it's not real.
Yeah.
And like I always bring up is that there's like some very serious limitations to science. So like I would go back to what science really is just the scientific method. And the scientific method is just a list of how to reason.
Or a
it's
list
like
of disproofs
yeah.
of a theory.
So, going back to so what are the literal limitations on science? One of them is it has to be testable, what you're doing. And so the time scales have to be human, knowing when it's if you can't learn something unless you measure it for a billion years, then science can't know that because we haven't even, human science hasn't been around for a billion years. So if it's something that has that long of an iteration, we'll just never know it, or science will never know it. So time scales affect. Basically, it's everything, you have to be able to observe it with your senses.
Right, and you said things that you can't measure too, right?
Yeah.
So that is relying on technology, right? And technology is always improving, and it's increasing our ability to measure things, but we can only measure a fraction of 1% of the things out there. Our tools that we think are so great and teaching us so much, and they are, is still super limited. There's a lot of things that are unmeasurable, it has, spirituality, the concept of God is not measurable necessarily, other things like that.
Yeah.
The empty space.
Yep. And there's another aspect of our reality too that I think plays into this. It's the more you learn, the less you know in absolute terms. And so that's the thing, the more you learn, the more stuff there is out there that you don't know. So one of my my favorite visualization of that concept, because it seems counterintuitive. More you learn, it should mean the less there is to know out there, because there should be this finite amount of stuff to know. But so it was actually Tesla who put this visualization of what's actually happening. Is imagine that you put a lamp in this big dark room, and so that this light sphere, there's this light sphere, and then you look at the darkness touching the light sphere on the outside. And so knowledge is increasing that light so that the light sphere gets bigger. But if you think about it, every time you make that light sphere bigger, the area of black touching that sphere grows too. And so that's why the more you learn, the less you know, is because the bigger that light sphere gets, so does the surface area of the black around it.
And that's what I find too. The more, I'll have an initial question, right? And I'll go online and I'll start researching, and I'll go into books and I'll start learning about it. And I always come out the other end with way more questions than I started with.
Yeah.
Right? Because the more I learned about it, it spurred 100 questions that came off of this one.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great metaphor for that.
Because, yeah, knowledge just keeps propagating out like that.
Yeah, almost fractal.
Fractal, yeah.
So I got to ask you this because we haven't even talked martial arts on the most of the podcast, and that's how I know you, is through Jiu-Jitsu and through the gym. So, given your own unique views and perspectives on reality and the mind, and how you experience it and how you apply it within the microcosm of yourself, and your own learning process, like, how do you apply all this knowledge of self and consciousness and what you are with these action potentials to your physical practice of jiu-jitsu? Because I know for me, I started jiu-jitsu before I started exploring quantum physics, metaphysics, and Buddhism. And my concept of jiu-jitsu back then was very rudimentary. It was very limited to physical properties, physical characteristics, large muscle movements and strength and power and things like this. But then I started getting into smaller aspects of quantum and quantum physics and things like metaphysics and things like that. And now when I'm on the mats, my whole concept of what is going on during like a live rolling match is not just two bodies being physical with each other, but is all these energetic interactions and give and take of energy, not just space, not just power and exertion, but energetic interactions and quantum entanglements and infinite possibilities and potentials and logic being applied, right? It's a training ground for how do we get from one problem that we're having and how do we solve the problem given the infinite possibilities to get it done. So how do you apply all this knowledge to your martial arts and your jiu-jitsu? Because you come from a judo background.
Right, yeah.
A lot of physics and judo.
Yeah. That's, that was one of my big interests. Is like, the first time you throw like a successful judo throw or, you do a successful sweep or anything like that, it feels effortless. Like, it's just like, wow, like this person weighs, like 200 pounds, but it felt like he weighed 50 or something, and it's like these force multipliers that come with it, and like, points of leverage and everything, using your hips to like, change as a leverage point. Right.
Angles, momentum,
yep.
Acceleration, deceleration, all these things.
Yep, and momentum and the flow of energy and like feeling, because there's so much like I have this book, it's called Best Judo. Most of my senseis have told me it's like the definitive book on judo. It was written by two Olympic level Korean masters. But in it, they talk
Korean
about
judo masters.
Oh yeah,
interesting. So the mastery didn't come from Japan, from its origins.
Yeah,
interesting.
They talk about like the 8 directions of possible places you could push your opponent. And then they also talk about the counter push. It's like you push them in the back left direction, and because they give you resistance, you want to do the throw in your back right position because it's opposite, and that's you're going to use their force against them. If you shove them and they try to like resist you, they have to push their force in that direction. So you push in that direction, and then you pull in that direction so that you use their force against them, basically. And like a lot of the book is setting up the throws. Kazushi is all about off balancing your opponent in the right directions according to like the flow of energy.
Yeah, it's almost like the path of least resistance for the energy to travel.
Yeah.
Right. So if you push into somebody and they push straight back, but then you try and divert that energy at a 90-degree angle, it's going to require a lot more effort for you to make that angle diversion rather than just going back with the 180-degree push and go straight back. So find the path of least resistance, and then use the physics of the body, of the anatomy of the human being to your advantage to make the throw happen.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, so I mean that's like the big physics interest I have in judo. I feel like it's been a while since I've read about it, but Jigoro Kano, the guy who discovered or developed judo, he was actually a university student in human anatomy, and so he was while he was a kid, he was young and sickly, and so he wanted to develop a way to fight, stronger, healthier kids that were picking on him, I guess.
No better way to fight them than to slam them into the planet.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
So I think that's the origins of Judo, pretty much. Nice. That's the story I heard anyway.
So how do you apply it to Jiu-Jitsu? Because Jiu-Jitsu is different in that
right.
You're integrating Judo for the takedown piece, but there's a lot. I mean, there's literally an infinite amount of approaches, sequences, angles, rotations that can be made. There's all sorts of explorations.
I have to admit, I still feel like I'm a bit novice still in the Jiu-Jitsu, because it is very similar to Judo, but especially when I was competing in Judo and like learning it, getting ready for competitions, they would stand you up after 30 seconds. So like if you go to the ground, if you're not choking them out within 30 seconds, they'll stand you back up. So I had very little interaction with the ground game aspect. But so far, like it seems like there's like a set sequence. There's like a type of sequence you can go through with Jiu-Jitsu. Like not necessarily like a set of moves per se, but so like you have them in your full guard. And then there's like 3 different positions you can go from there, and then you pick one of those positions, and then there's like 3 positions you can go from there. And it's like that's the
yes and no. Like so you got the basic foundation, right? So you have someone in your guard, and you're trying to get to advance your position to one of the 3 better positions. So there may be 3 better positions you can be in, but there's maybe, I don't know, 200-300 different ways to get to position number 1, 200-300 different ways to get to the second position, 200 or 300 different ways to get to the third. And in each of those approaches, if they block you on your approach and you have to divert your path and take a different approach, that counts as a whole approach in and of itself, right? So each approach has like these, there's a direct line approach to getting where you want to go, but more than likely, if you're going against someone who's trained, they're gonna put up defenses along the way, and so that straight line approach to the armbar that you want to get from your guard may happen on someone untrained. But as soon as you start reaching obstacles, you have to find different branches off of this tree and different limbs in order to get to the same outcome, right? So it's like it's infinite and fractal in that sense, right? Because you don't know all the time what your opponent's going to throw up to defend you, but you get good at predicting what they're going to do based on, in training with us, based on your relationship to each other, right? Like, so I've rolled with Z enough times that I know what he's going to do to me in certain positions, and so I can counteract that before I know that he starts his sequence, right? So then there's timing and there's sequencing and things like that, and disrupting his sequence. So there's this concept, I don't know if you've heard of, called the OODA loop. Have you heard of that? So it was developed by this, I think he was a World War II fighter pilot, and he developed this mental strategy to disrupt the strategies of the people he was dogfighting against.
Oh, really?
So the OODA loop, and I'll Google it real quick, but it stands for something. It's OODA, and let me see this real quick. So the OODA loop, so the cycle is observe, orient, decide, and act. So first you're observing what your opponent is doing, and this can be, in Jiu-Jitsu terms, this can be visually, or when you get up to a higher rank and you're starting, you can roll with your eyes closed and use more somatic senses, then that can be counted as observation too, right? So you're observing, and then you orient yourself based on what you're observing. So now I see what you're doing, so now I'm going to orient myself to either best defend or best attack based on what you're doing. Then I'm going to decide what is the best course of action from that new orientation or the new perspective, and then I'm going to act, right? So the point is to try and orient simultaneously as you observe, so that you're already acting on your opponent before they can reorient, right? So you're trying to disrupt their OODA loop. So the OODA loop is like this natural process of like
I see what you're saying.
How we orient and reorient and attack and defend, and you're trying to disrupt their loop system, their cycle, by orienting yourself as you're observing their orientation.
Oh, that's really cool.
So it's more of like a timing thing. But yeah, it was developed by this dogfighting Air Force pilot. It's pretty cool.
So you just like observe your opponent's like cycle, and then you try to interrupt it using your cycle, basically, is kind of thing.
Yeah, so you observe their cycle, and all you need to do is disrupt the cycle.
Okay.
Disrupt what they are planning to do. And as soon as you disrupt what they're doing, now they're automatically on the defensive.
I see.
And before they can reset back into a new cycle of attack, you have already disrupted theirs, and you're on the attack, right? So you're kind of, it's like if someone...
it's like how to achieve the initiative in these situations, kind of thing.
Yeah, so if someone like winds up to take a punch at you, right, and they're winding up real big, and you're observing that this is what they're doing, and they're setting up, but you you disrupt my attack before it happens. So if you observe me winding up, and then right away you throw a straight punch to my nose, well, that just disrupted the entire attack that I was doing, and now I have to reorient to form my next attack, right?
I see.
Whereas when you disrupted it, that's your chance to initiate your OODA loop, and now you orient to my disorientation, and you can attack before I can reorient to attack.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's almost a strategy. It's a strategical thing. Pretty cool. Really interesting. So yeah, it's interesting how we apply a lot of these higher order concepts that we think about and that we talk about in our everyday, you and I talk about in our everyday life, quantum physics, things like that, and how we start to apply it. I think that's the most interesting piece. It's one thing to have the knowledge up here in your brain and to just think about these topics, and it's really interesting to do that, but it's a whole nother ball game to start to self-experiment with them and be like, how can I take this idea that I just learned from this book and apply it to my perception of this activity that I love to do, or this relationship that I'm in, right? So when I first learned about quantum entanglement, I looked into human interaction between twins, right? And it's interesting how twins can sense each other over long distances simultaneously. When one thing's happening to one, halfway across the world, the other one will feel it.
Really?
Yeah. Or like connections between mothers and their kids, right? If something bad happens to their kid, the parent can sense it before they ever get a call from the coroner or the police or whoever saying something happened to your kid. So it's interesting how we can take these theoretical concepts that have also been somewhat proven and start applying them to things that happen in everyday life. I think it brings more understanding of what's going on, but it also brings more questions.
Yes.
Yeah. But I think that's the interesting thing, is that it brings more questions.
Yeah. And you have applying the knowledge you have to your everyday life.
So if you, and we're running a little short on time, but if you could, from all your experiences and all your, your psychedelic insights and your insights from education and reading and researching on your own, from self-experience and martial arts and what you've learned from there, because I know you've learned a lot more than just physical abilities, but out of all that stuff, if you could impart some Patrick wisdom on the people out there listening, what would that be? I think that we all have some valuable information to share with everyone else. Again, we're all fractalized components of this one larger organism, but we seem so disconnected from each other. It's almost like the organism is starting to split apart, and I'm trying to bring us back together by sharing more with each other.
So what do I have that helps me, that might help other people?
Yeah.
One of the things that I always fall back on for helping with self-improvement and, being able to get through like tough times, like, like open bat, being under Jake, or like, trying to really wrap my head around like that concept of different types of infinites. I had to watch the video tons and tons of times, and at a certain point you're like, I just don't understand this. I can't understand this, right? But one of the things that helps me get through all those kind of barriers is, I think it's called like mantra. They talk about like just a thing you repeat to yourself to help you get through that. I've kind of I have different this like saying I give to myself that like, to recenter, I think you can say. Part of it was actually kind of like a gift from my family in a way. So I have a coat of arms, Gorman's, and it has words that go along with it. The Latin for it is primi et ultimi in bello, which is first and last in battle. So,
where's your heritage from?
Ireland.
Ireland, okay. I'm half Irish too.
Oh, okay.
Lemaster is Irish.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, me neither. I thought it was French my whole life until like 2 years ago.
Would have been my guess, yeah. So I have those words, and it basically means to me never give up. And I take that as like, that's what they thought was important, and that's what should be shared, and that's the goal to achieve, is to be the first and last in battle.
That makes a lot of sense why you're one of the last people to leave the mat on open mat day.
Yeah, I try to hold to that. And there's another part of it is sometimes when you, like, I always try to remember that losing is you learn more from losing than you do from winning. So I try to think I will succeed or I will learn, and always seek improvement. That's kind of like my algorithm for like getting better and learning always. Is that either I succeed and I solve the problem, or I learn how to solve the problem. I don't lose. Because when you start thinking I lose all the time, I'm a loser, like that stuff, it's like a negative feedback loop. It starts feeding into itself because you stop improving, and then you just feel like you suck, so it's like, because I suck at this, then I suck at everything, and I can't understand anything. And so like my way to get like out of that negative feedback loop that like seems to stick people is to stick to my algorithm, which is either succeed or learn, and always seek improvement. So like the always seek improvement part is so I never get comfortable with something that just works. I want to try to make it better always. So like you don't, so you can find a better way to do things. So the full thing is I'll succeed or I'll learn, and always seek improvement. Primi et ultimi in bello. So if I ever like reach like an obstacle and I feel like I can't overcome it, I just like back away, like stop thinking about it, and then like I use that to get my like courage back up, basically. Nice. So like those words work for me. It has particular power, I'd have to say, because it comes from my family, and I feel like it's almost those past generations giving me their strength. So I think this concept of the mantra is in Buddhism too, and like having words of encouragement to like repeat to yourself.
Absolutely.
So
yeah, mantras are Buddhists use them for different reasons. In sports psychology, we would call these trigger words or trigger phrases that have deep meaning to yourself and are short, usually very brief. So yours was less than a paragraph, right? But it has so much meaning, so much emotional content behind it. It motivates you, it drives you, it gets you going again, it initiates action. So a trigger word or trigger phrase could be anything that people resonate with. Mine is personally stepping onto the mat in competition. I say calm, cool, and collected. And each one of those words has like pages and pages of meaning for me. But they're all performance-based, right? So that's a performance-based mantra. And then I have other mantras for other things too. But I like that a lot. I think the listeners are going to take that and probably start asking themselves, what is something short that I can tell myself to get me back on track?
Yeah.
I want to thank you for coming on the show today, Patrick.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it was awesome, and hope to have you on again soon. I think we can go into a lot of these topics in much greater depth, and we didn't even hardly scratch the surface of martial arts.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
I know we could talk for hours on that, too. So, yeah, I hope to have you back soon.
Definitely.
All right, for all you listeners out there, this has been Conversations with the Mind with Patrick Gorman and Shane Lemaster. Until next time, stay true to yourselves, stay good, and keep on exploring. Explore that innerverse. Peace. All right. Conversations with the Mind podcast is sponsored
by mindops.com. You can find us at www.mind-ops.com. We're an eclectic counseling company providing mental health and mental performance services to individuals, small and large groups, teams, businesses, military, through face-to-face sessions or at a distance using phone or confidential video chat apps. We bring a unique Buddhist Western lens and specialize in general psychotherapy for all mental difficulties, sport and performance psychology for performance enhancement, addiction counseling for any maladaptive or destructive habits, and psychedelic integration therapy to make the most from your visionary medicine work. We are available as well for corporate workshops to address the needs of your employees' wellness.